The prairie was silent save for the restless wind. It cut across the open land in long, mournful sighs, stirring the tall grass until it bent like waves upon a sea of dust. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried, and the sound echoed in the emptiness, sharp and hollow against the expanse of sky. But down along the wagon trail, silence had turned into something heavier. A single wagon lay overturned on its side, its canvas torn and ripped open like a wound. The wooden spokes of its wheels were splintered, one still creaking faintly in the wind as though protesting the violence that had torn it apart. Around it, scattered provisions painted a grim picture, sacks of flour torn open and spilling pale dust across the dirt, a cradle tipped over on its side, a broken rifle lying in the grass. And among these abandoned remnants, darker stains marked the earth, patches of blood dried brown against the soil. It was here in the late summer of 1847 that a passing trader made the discovery. His name has long since slipped into obscurity, but his words remained etched in testimony, carried down through whispers of the frontier. It was as though the people had been swallowed whole, not a sound, not a soul, only the mark of violence left behind. He dismounted his horse slowly, the animal uneasy beneath him, its ears flicking at the smell of dried blood in the air. The man walked with care, calling out, hoping against hope that anyone might answer. But the prairie gave nothing back. He found no bodies, only their absence. Bedrolls lay abandoned, their blankets rumpled as though pulled away in haste. A bonnet rested in the dirt beside a child's wooden toy horse. The cradle, too small to have carried its passenger far, stood empty, rocking faintly in the breeze. He found a torn scrap of women's clothing snagged on the jagged edge of a broken wheel. A cooking pot overturned, its last meal long since hardened into an unrecognizable crust. The longer he searched, the deeper his unease grew. He saw the signs of a struggle, dragged footprints, a trail of overturned belongings, a fire pit stamped out mid-meal. It was not the kind of disorder left behind by panicked travelers fleeing from weather, nor even by a raid from passing strangers. This was different. This was chaos carved by betrayal. The trader remounted, his heart heavy, and rode on to the next settlement. There he would tell his story of the abandoned wagons, of the blood and silence left on the prairie. And as he spoke, a question began to rise among those who listened, one that would spread in low voices from town to town along the frontier. What had happened to those families who had set out under the guidance of a man they trusted? In the age of westward expansion, wagon guides were the lifeline between survival and ruin. Men who knew the rivers, the mountain passes, the dangers of the wild. Their judgment determined whether families made it through or perished on the trail. A good guide was worth his weight in gold. A bad one could spell disaster. But this was something worse. This was not the story of a guide who failed in his duty. This was the story of a guide who turned against his own travelers. A man who did not simply lose them to hunger, to weather, or to chance, but who led them into danger himself. His name was Orin Bellamy, and the tale of his betrayal would leave scars upon the frontier long after the last wagon wheel rolled westward. The camera of history lingers on that desolate trail, the broken wagon, the blood on the earth, and the children's shoes left in the dust, because those shoes would never be worn again. And with that haunting image, the question remains, how could trust once freely given turn into the deadliest weapon of all? Fade to black. The story of Orin Bellamy is only beginning. The year was 1847. America was in the midst of its great westward push, a migration unlike anything the young nation had ever seen. Across the eastern states, families packed their lives into wooden wagons, sold what they could not carry, and set their sights on Oregon and California. It was a promise: fertile land, open skies, and the chance to carve a future free from the crowded streets and failing farms of the East. But the promise came with peril. The Oregon Trail was not a road so much as a series of rutted paths beaten into the earth by those who came before. Travelers braved swollen rivers that swallowed oxen whole, storms that tore across the plains without warning, and the slow death of cholera and dysentery, which claimed more lives than arrows or bullets ever did. Food spoiled, wagons broke, and every mile west carried with it the shadow of uncertainty. For those daring to risk it, the wagon guide became the most important figure of all. A guide was navigator, scout, and protector. He decided when to ford rivers, where to camp, and how to ration supplies. Without him, settlers were little more than strangers dragging their hopes blindly into the wilderness. With him, they stood a chance at reaching the promised land alive. Among the many guides who advertised their services in town postings and word of mouth was a man named Orin Bellamy. He was in his late 30s then, broad-shouldered and with the weathered look of a man who had spent years on the trail. His voice carried an easy confidence, and when he spoke of rivers and passes, his words painted the picture of a man who had been there, who had seen it all before. Families trusted him. How could they not? In a world where survival depended on leadership, Bellamy seemed to carry authority in his stance, certainty in his tone. Some described him as charismatic, others as reserved but capable. When he told settlers that he could guide them safely west, they believed him. But behind that reputation lay shadows few could see. Rumors whispered that Bellamy had debts in more than one town, that he gambled what little he earned and had left more than one failed venture in his wake. He was restless, never staying long in one place and always chasing something, money perhaps, or power. Outwardly, he played the role of a seasoned trailman. Inwardly, some suspected he carried a hunger that had little to do with survival and everything to do with self-interest. The families who gathered under his charge could not have known this. To them, he was the answer to their prayers. Among them were the Miller family, a husband and wife with 3 children under the age of 12, eager to claim fertile farmland in Oregon. There were the Carters, a young couple who had left behind factory smoke and crowded boarding houses in St. Louis for a dream of open skies. Others, 2 widows, farmers, men who believed gold might wait in California. They were ordinary people with extraordinary hope, and they looked at Bellamy not as a stranger, but as the man who would carry them safely through the wilderness. Life on the trail began with rhythm and routine. At dawn, the crack of whips split the air as oxen strained against harnesses. Dust rose in clouds, clinging to faces and hair, seeping into every crevice of clothing. By day, the wagons creaked in long columns, the sound of iron-rimmed wheels groaning over ruts and rocks. Children walked alongside barefoot, their laughter carrying faintly on the dry wind. At night, fires glowed against the darkness, the smell of beans and salted pork drifting into the prairie air. Some sang hymns, others traded stories, and in those first days the road west felt less like a trial and more like the beginning of a grand adventure. Bellamy rode at the head, his figure always in sight. From a distance, he was a steady silhouette against the horizon, the man with the answers, the one who knew where they were going. To the settlers, he was their compass, their safeguard, their protector. But trust can be a fragile thing. And what none of them realized, what none of them could even imagine, was that the very man they relied on, the very man who carried their hopes westward, would soon lead them not toward salvation, but toward betrayal, because Orin Bellamy was not just a wagon guide. He was something else entirely. Fade into suspenseful music. The wagons roll on beneath the wide, merciless sky, every creak of their wheels carrying them closer to a danger they cannot see. At first, the journey westward followed the rhythm of countless wagon trains before them. Days stretched long beneath the burning sun, the horizon a straight and endless line. Bellamy rode ahead, pointing out streams where the travelers could water their animals, steering them around bogged marshland, warning them when the skies darkened with the threat of storms. The settlers looked to him with gratitude. For a time he gave them reason to believe their trust had been well placed, but slowly something began to change. Bellamy's decisions grew curious. He started insisting the group leave the well-worn trail to follow lesser-known paths. He told them he knew of shortcuts, routes that would save them days, perhaps even weeks, if they followed his lead. The promise of time saved was tempting. Every family knew that each lost week meant dwindling supplies, harsher weather, and the threat of being stranded when winter fell. And so they followed him off the main track, their wagons creaking into the tall grass where no other ruts guided the way. At first, no one questioned him. He spoke with confidence, swearing he had traveled these paths before. But after several days, doubts began to stir. The terrain was rougher, the rivers more dangerous to cross. The wagons strained against unseen gullies and animals stumbled in mud that sucked at their hooves. And then, food began to disappear. The Millers, who rationed carefully, discovered their flour sacks had been tampered with. The Carters awoke one morning to find their small barrel of whiskey, carefully kept for medicine and trade, gone entirely. A rifle, too, vanished from one of the wagons, though Bellamy assured them it must have been stolen in the night by passing tribes. His tone was calm, his eyes unwavering, but already a shadow of unease fell over the group. Still, who would dare accuse the man guiding them? What would it mean to doubt the very figure who claimed to hold their lives in his hands? Tensions began to rise among the travelers themselves. Families quarreled, suspicions whispered in the dark. Some accused others of theft, while Bellamy fanned the flames, suggesting that perhaps not everyone in the wagon train could be trusted. His authority became a wedge, separating those who feared losing his favor from those who dared to question him. And then came the first true act of violence. It was near the banks of a shallow river. Night had fallen and fires burned low, their embers snapping into the black sky. Families were huddled in their blankets when shots shattered the silence. Screams followed, chaos erupting as oxen bellowed and wagons shuddered under the panic of stampeding animals. When it was over, one wagon lay abandoned, its passengers gone, dead, though their bodies were swiftly buried by the survivors. Bellamy insisted it had been an ambush, raiders slipping in under cover of darkness. But some noticed details that gnawed at their minds. The angle of the bullets, the fact that nothing had been stolen, only destroyed. As days stretched on, the number of travelers dwindled. Some vanished overnight, their belongings later found among Bellamy's own packs. Others grew weak from hunger when rations mysteriously ran short, left behind with vague promises that they would be rescued later. Bellamy grew harsher, his voice less reassuring, his decisions no longer questioned but feared. One evening, a widow named Mrs. Halloway confronted him by the firelight, her voice trembling but firm. She accused him of hoarding supplies, of leading them astray on purpose. Witnesses later described the moment as tense, almost unbearable, her thin figure standing against the broad shadow of the man they had once trusted. Bellamy listened, his face calm, his eyes cold. And then, without raising his voice, he told the others that she had gone mad from grief, that her words were the poison of someone who wanted to destroy the group from within. By morning, Mrs. Halloway was gone. Her belongings were found scattered near her wagon. Some said she fled into the wilderness. Others whispered that Bellamy ensured she never spoke again. But no one dared ask him openly. Fear had silenced them. The wagon train had become a trap, each family too afraid to leave yet too terrified to stay. Children cried at night, their parents whispering desperate prayers into the dark. The land stretched out before them, endless and merciless, and every step forward carried them deeper into the grasp of the very man they had trusted to lead them to safety. The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was happening in plain sight. But by the time the settlers realized the truth, it was already too late. The creak of wagons fades under the sound of a heartbeat, steady and ominous. Survivors begin to suspect what they had once thought impossible, that the greatest danger on the trail was not sickness, nor storm, nor strangers. It was the man at the head of the line. The prairie has a way of keeping its secrets. Winds scatter footprints, rains wash away blood, and the vast distances between settlements allow whispers of tragedy to dissolve before they can take root. But Orin Bellamy's trail of betrayal would not stay buried. Survivors carried it back with them, tattered, starving, and half mad with grief, bearing a story too shocking to ignore. The first to return was a boy no older than 14, gaunt from hunger, his face hollowed by sun and sorrow. He staggered into a frontier town along the Missouri River, his clothes torn, his hands blistered. He spoke in fragments about wagons overturned, about families abandoned, about the guide who had led them astray. At first, locals dismissed him as another broken traveler, delirious from the journey. But then came others. A wounded man limping on a crude crutch fashioned from a tree branch. A mother clutching a baby, both wrapped in rags, their eyes wide with terror. Their stories matched the boys, each detail filling the gaps left by the other. It was enough to rouse suspicion, and suspicion spread quickly across the frontier. Townsfolk who had once admired Bellamy's reputation now whispered his name with fear. Had he truly betrayed the very people he was meant to protect? Had he killed them, stolen from them, abandoned them to die? Law enforcement on the frontier was fragile, a patchwork of sheriffs, marshals, and posses who operated as much on instinct as on law. Still, the accounts demanded action. Word reached the nearest federal marshal, and soon riders were sent in search of Bellamy. Handbills were posted with his description. A tall man, broad-shouldered, hair dark and flecked with gray, often seen in a long trail coat. He was wanted for questioning in connection to multiple disappearances on the westward trail. Tracking him was no simple task. The land was vast, and Bellamy knew it better than most. Weeks stretched into months, the wilderness swallowing clues as quickly as they appeared. But the settlers' stories gave investigators one advantage. They knew he would not be traveling empty-handed. He carried items that did not belong to him. Women's jewelry, children's toys, rifles etched with initials not his own. So they began asking questions at trading posts, saloons, and way stations, following the faint scent of a man trying to turn stolen lives into coin. The break came at a riverside trading post in Nebraska Territory. A merchant recalled a man who matched Bellamy's description. He had arrived alone, leading a mule laden with goods, pots, blankets, and trinkets that seemed oddly out of place for a solitary traveler. The merchant grew uneasy when the man tried to sell him a small wooden toy horse, crudely carved but worn with the marks of a child's hands. It was not the kind of thing most men parted with willingly. The merchant remembered the name he gave, Orin Bellamy, and with that, the net began to close. A posse of lawmen and volunteers set out, following his trail along the river. For days they rode hard, through storms that lashed the plains and nights when the cold sank into their bones. Finally, they found him camped near a shallow crossing, his fire burning low, his mule still burdened with the belongings of the dead. Accounts of the arrest vary. Some say Bellamy reached for his rifle but froze when he saw the barrels aimed back at him. Others insist he simply looked up, weary, as though he had expected this moment all along. What is certain is that he did not fight. He surrendered with a calm that unsettled the men who had hunted him, a quiet acceptance that seemed more chilling than any outburst of violence. He was taken in chains to the nearest town, where word of his capture spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the man whose name had become a curse along the trail. Mothers held their children closer. Fathers clenched their fists. Survivors who had escaped his treachery wept at the sight of him shackled, yet still feared the cold emptiness in his eyes. For now, the prairie had given up one of its darkest secrets, but the question remained. What justice could be delivered in a land still struggling to define law itself? And would the testimony of broken survivors be enough to bring down a man who once walked as a guide, a protector, a leader? Fade into tense silence. The camera lingers on Bellamy's chained hands, the iron biting into his wrists as the narrator asks. Orin Bellamy was captured. But would he ever truly answer for the lives lost under his command? The courthouse stood at the edge of town, a plain wooden building that creaked in the wind and smelled of pine and dust. Inside, however, it became a theater of grief. People packed the benches, their boots scuffing against the worn planks, their whispers echoing beneath the low rafters. Everyone wanted to see the man whose betrayal had become legend before the ink on his wanted posters had even dried. Orin Bellamy was led in chains, his posture still straight, his eyes still steady. He looked less like a hunted outlaw than a man walking to his own appointment. Those who saw him that day remembered his calm, the way he scanned the faces of the crowd as though measuring them, as though daring them to meet his gaze. For some, that calm was more unsettling than any outburst of violence could have been. The trial began with testimony. Survivors stood before the judge and jury, their voices breaking as they recalled the nights of terror on the trail. The Miller boy, now gaunt but alive, described how Bellamy had taken food and weapons from wagons, how he claimed raiders had struck when in truth it was Bellamy himself orchestrating the ambushes. A grieving husband recounted the moment he realized his wife had vanished in the night, her belongings later found among Bellamy's packs. Mrs. Carter, clutching the hand of her only surviving child, spoke through tears of how Bellamy abandoned the weak, assuring the group they would be rescued while he stole away with the provisions meant to sustain them. Each testimony struck the courtroom like a hammer, yet Bellamy showed little reaction. He would tilt his head, occasionally shake it, sometimes even smile faintly as if amused by the accounts of those who once followed him. When asked to speak, he denied everything. He insisted that raiders had been responsible, that supplies were stolen by desperate travelers, that survivors were blinded by grief and needed a scapegoat. He called himself a victim of circumstance, a man punished for having the misfortune of leading a doomed party west. But the evidence was damning. Traders came forward recalling the jewelry, the rifles, the children's toys Bellamy tried to sell along the trail, objects that could only have come from families who never returned. The jury saw not just a man accused of negligence, but one who profited from the destruction of those under his care. The trial did not last long. In a land where law was still raw and justice often swift, the verdict came as little surprise. Guilty on all counts: murder, theft, betrayal of trust. The sentence was death by hanging. On the morning of his execution, the town gathered once again. The air was cold, the sky heavy with gray clouds that seemed to press low upon the horizon. Bellamy was led to the gallows, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. Some accounts say he looked defiant, others that he appeared strangely at peace. When asked for final words, he spoke only this: "I did what I had to do. The trail is no place for the weak." The crowd fell silent as the noose was placed around his neck. Moments later, the trapdoor gave way and Orin Bellamy's body swung against the bleak morning sky. His death was not met with cheers but with a heavy quiet. For many there was no satisfaction, only the hollow recognition that nothing could return the lives he had stolen. In the weeks that followed, his name became a warning whispered along the wagon trails. Families were urged to know their guides well, to watch them closely, to never place blind trust in a stranger no matter how capable he appeared. Some guides suffered suspicion unfairly, yet the shadow of Bellamy lingered, reshaping the fragile trust that bound wagon companies together. For the survivors, the scars ran deeper. The Millers never spoke openly of the trail again. The Carters reached Oregon, but neighbors later recalled how Mrs. Carter would sometimes wake screaming in the night, clutching her child, calling out for those she had lost. Even decades later, when the West had changed and the wagon trails were all but abandoned, the children who survived Bellamy's betrayal carried with them memories they could not shake. The firelight, the gunshots, the terrible silence that followed, and so Orin Bellamy became more than a man. He became a tale, a reminder carved into the history of the frontier, a story told around campfires passed between travelers, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes softened, but always carrying the same truth: that danger on the trail did not always come from storm or sickness or strangers. Sometimes it came from within. Sometimes the predator was the very man who rode at the head of the line. The screen fades to black as the narrator's voice lowers. On the open frontier, trust was everything. For those who followed Orin Bellamy, it became the deadliest mistake